A man with a loaded gun to your head is terrifying. A man who hasn't eaten in 7 days because he trusts no one, not even his own blood, is a walking apocalypse. Gabriel Hayes built his empire on loyalty, but paranoia was starving him to death. His chefs were beaten, his capos were terrified. Then came a quiet diner waitress with a cheap apron and a faded recipe card. She didn't serve him a meal. She served him a memory. The Wagyu beef sat on the porcelain plate, cooling rapidly in the air-conditioned chill of the penthouse. Beside it, a delicate drizzle of truffle reduction congealed into a dark, unappetizing glaze. Gabriel Hayes stared at it. His eyes, sunken into the hollows of a face that had aged a decade in the last month, traced the grain of the meat. He didn't see a $300 steak. He saw arsenic. He saw cyanide. He saw the foaming mouth of his underboss, Paulie, collapsing face first into a plate of lobster risotto just 2 weeks ago. "Boss, you have to eat." The voice belonged to Leo, Gabriel's oldest enforcer. Leo was a man who had broken kneecaps with a tire iron without breaking a sweat. But right now, his voice trembled. He stood near the doorway of the dining room, his massive frame shifting uncomfortably. Gabriel didn't look up. He reached out with a hand that shook, just a fraction, just enough to humiliate him, and pushed the plate away. The china scraped against the mahogany table. The sound was loud in the dead silence of the room. "Get it out of here," Gabriel rasped. His throat was dry. His vocal cords felt like sandpaper rubbing together. "Gabriel, please!" Leo pushed, taking a tentative step forward. The chef tasted it. I watched him. He took a bite of It's clean. Paulie's chef tasted the risotto, Gabriel whispered. He died in the ambulance. Paulie died on the floor. Gabriel leaned back in his leather chair, closing his eyes. The hunger was a living thing inside his stomach. It gnawed at his ribs, clawed up his throat, and left him lightheaded. He had survived bullets, federal indictments, and the brutal hostile takeovers of the North Side docks. He had clawed his way out of the gutter with nothing but bruised knuckles and a ruthless intellect. Now, at 38, sitting at the pinnacle of the city's underworld, he was going to die of starvation in a gilded cage. He hadn't kept a solid meal down in 8 days. The paranoia was a thick, suffocating blanket over his mind. He tasted metallic poison in bottled water. He smelled bitter almonds in freshly baked bread. The syndicate was whispering, "A boss who can't stand up without holding the edge of a table is a boss who is ready to be replaced." Gabriel knew the vultures were circling. He just couldn't force his jaw to chew. "Get the cars," Gabriel said suddenly, opening his eyes. Leo blinked. "The cars? Boss, it's pouring out there. Where are we going?" "I don't know," Gabriel said, gripping the armrests and forcing himself to his feet. The room spun, tilting dangerously before righting itself. He swallowed hard, waiting for his vision to clear. "Just drive. Away from my kitchens. Away from my people." 20 minutes later, a fleet of 3 black SUVs cut through the relentless evening rain. The city was a blur of neon and wet asphalt. Gabriel sat in the back of the middle vehicle, his head resting against the cool glass. The hunger pangs had shifted from a sharp stabbing to a dull, echoing ache. He watched the neighborhoods change. The high-rises gave way to brick tenements. The pristine sidewalks turned cracked and littered. They were deep in the South End. It was an area Gabriel hadn't controlled in years, mostly because there was nothing left to bleed from it. "Pull over," Gabriel ordered. The driver checked the rearview mirror, confused. "Here, boss." "Here." The SUV lurched to a halt beside a cracked curb. Across the street, a flickering neon sign hummed violently in the rain, buzzing like an angry hornet. Benny's. Half the letters were burned out. It looked like the kind of place where you went to get food poisoning on purpose. Leo was already barking into his radio. 4 men piled out of the front and rear cars, hands hovering inside their soaked jackets. They moved with practiced, lethal efficiency, crossing the street and pushing through the glass door of the diner. Gabriel waited a full minute before stepping out into the rain. The cold water felt good on his face. It felt real. Inside, the diner smelled of stale coffee, burnt grease, and cheap bleach. It was a sharp contrast to the sanitized air of his penthouse. 3 patrons, a trucker, an exhausted nurse, and a guy sleeping in a booth were being ushered out the back door by Leo's men. The owner, a balding man with a stained apron, was backed against the pie case, his hands raised in the air. Gabriel walked in, his wet Italian leather shoes squelching against the cheap linoleum floor. He slid into a red vinyl booth that had been taped up with duct tape. He felt the cold springs through the seat. "Lock the doors," Gabriel said quietly. Leo flipped the sign to "Closed" and pulled down the blinds. The diner was completely sealed off. "You," Gabriel said, pointing a finger at the terrified owner. "Cook something. Use fresh ingredients. Unopened packages. If I see you reach into a prep bin, I'll have my men break your hands." The owner, Benny, swallowed so hard it looked painful. "I just run the grill, mister. We got burgers. We got meatloaf. But the meatloaf was prepped this morning." "Then make something else," Gabriel said, the exhaustion finally bleeding heavily into his voice. "Just make me something I can eat." In the cramped, sweltering kitchen behind the swinging doors, Nora Bennett stood frozen against the dish pit. She had been scrubbing a scorched frying pan when the men in black suits stormed the dining room. Now, she watched Benny hyperventilating by the flat-top grill, his hands shaking so violently he dropped a pair of metal tongs onto the greasy floor. "Benny, what's going on?" Nora whispered, wiping her hands on her apron. She was 24, tired down to her bones, and just wanted to finish her shift so she could go home and study for her nursing exams. "They're Mafia," Benny hissed, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "That's Gabriel Hayes. He's crazy. Word on the street is he executes people for looking at him wrong. He wants food, unprepped, fresh packages only." "Nora, I can't even hold a knife right now." Nora peeked through the small porthole window of the swinging door. She saw the men standing guard. Then she saw the man in the booth, Gabriel Hayes. He didn't look like a terrifying mob boss. He looked like a man who was hollowed out. His skin was grey, his posture slumped, his eyes staring blankly at the scratched surface of the table. He looked like the stray dogs Nora used to feed in the alleys behind her old apartment building, starving, defensive, and ready to bite out of sheer terror. She looked back at Benny. He was trying to tear open a vacuum-sealed pack of ground beef, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. "Move," Nora said softly. "Nora, don't get involved. If he doesn't like it, he's going to shoot you if you take another 10 minutes to open a bag of meat," Nora said, her voice steady. The truth was, she was terrified too. But her pragmatism overrode her fear. You don't survive growing up in the Narrows by freezing up when things go bad. You adapt. She stepped up to the prep station. She ignored the open bins of diced onions and sliced tomatoes. The man wanted unopened, safe, paranoia. She scanned the dry storage shelves and the walk-in fridge, whole potatoes in a burlap sack, an untouched plastic-wrapped chuck roast meant for tomorrow's stew, a fresh bundle of carrots, a sealed carton of beef broth, a dusty bottle of cheap red cooking wine. She grabbed them all. As she set the roast on the cutting board, a memory struck her. It was a smell, a ghost of a scent from 15 years ago. Apartment 4B. The peeling wallpaper. The radiator that clanked all night. An old woman named Rosa, whose hands were always dusted with flour. Rosa used to babysit Nora when her mother worked double shifts. Rosa made a specific stew. She didn't call it stew, she called it stracotto, a peasant pot roast. The secret, little bird, Rosa had told a 9-year-old Nora, is not the meat. The meat is cheap. The secret is the dirt and the spice. Thyme for the dirt, cinnamon for the soul. Nora moved with a sudden, frantic rhythm. She tore open the plastic, salted the heavy block of beef, and threw it into a cast-iron Dutch oven. The loud hiss of searing meat filled the small kitchen. She chopped potatoes, snapped the tops off carrots, and smashed whole cloves of garlic with the flat of her blade. She deglazed the pan with the cheap red wine. The sharp smell of alcohol burned off, leaving a rich, fruity aroma. She poured in the sealed broth, tossed in the vegetables, and then went to the spice rack. She found dried thyme. She found the cinnamon. She added a heavy pinch of both, then an extra dash of black pepper. She slammed a lid on it and pushed it to the hottest part of the stove, turning the flames up to a dangerous height to force a rapid boil, then dropping it to simmer. It wasn't a traditional slow cook. The meat wouldn't fall apart completely. But the gravy, the thick, dark, fragrant gravy, would be identical. 35 minutes later, the diner was dead silent. The goons were restless. Benny was praying in the corner. Nora ladled the thick stew into a heavy ceramic bowl. She grabbed a sealed packet of oyster crackers and placed it on the side of the saucer. She didn't ask Benny to carry it out. She pushed through the swinging doors herself. The heavy gaze of 5 armed men instantly fell on her. Nora kept her eyes down. She walked carefully, the bowl radiating intense heat through the ceramic, burning her fingertips. She reached the taped-up booth and set the bowl down in front of Gabriel Hayes. Steam curled up in thick ribbons, carrying the sharp scent of thyme, roasted garlic, and that faint, confusing whisper of cinnamon. Gabriel stared at the bowl. He didn't move. He looked at Nora. I watched her make it, Leo muttered from a few feet away. She opened everything from scratch. Gabriel picked up a cheap, stamped metal spoon. His hand was still shaking. He dipped it into the dark brown gravy, catching a piece of potato and a shred of beef. He brought it to his lips, blowing softly, his eyes locked on Nora with a dark, predatory suspicion. He took the bite. Nora held her breath. She expected him to spit it out, to flip the table, to order his men to burn the place down. Instead, Gabriel froze. The spoon remained in his mouth for a long second. Slowly he pulled it out. His chest stopped heaving. The hard, violent lines around his eyes slackened. For a terrifying, silent moment, he just sat there, staring at the empty spoon. Then, Gabriel Hayes, the most feared man in the city's underworld, lowered his head, dug the spoon back into the bowl, and began to eat. He ate quickly, desperately, scraping the sides of the ceramic, the sounds of his chewing the only noise in the diner. He didn't look for poison. He didn't pause to check his throat. He just ate until the bowl was completely empty. When he finally set the spoon down, he looked up at Nora. The hollow deadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a violent, desperate clarity. "Who taught you how to make that?" His voice cracked. "An old neighbor," Nora said quietly, wrapping her arms around her waist. "Rosa." Gabriel's breath hitched. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the booth. "Rosa died 10 years ago," he whispered, staring at the empty bowl. "She was my mother." The silence in the diner was absolute. The neon sign buzzing through the rain-streaked window seemed to fade into a low, distant hum. Gabriel stared at Nora, his dark eyes wide, the hardened shell of the city's most dangerous man cracking apart to reveal something raw and wounded beneath. "Rosa," Gabriel repeated. The name sounded foreign on his tongue, a word he hadn't allowed himself to speak in a decade. "You knew Rosa." Nora stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the empty bowl, then back to his face. The grey pallor of his skin was already starting to recede, replaced by a faint, flushed warmth. He looked less like a ghost, and more like a man who had just woken up from a violent dream. "She lived in apartment 4B in the Narrows," Nora said, her voice quiet but steady. "I lived in 4C. My mum worked double shifts at the hospital. Rosa watched me after school. She taught me how to cook when I was barely tall enough to reach the stove." Gabriel's hand hovered over the table. His knuckles were white. "She lived in the Narrows until she died. She refused to leave." "I know." Nora swallowed the lump in her throat. She remembered the cramped, drafty apartment. She'd remembered the smell of garlic and cheap tobacco, the old radiator that hissed all winter. And she remembered the framed photograph on Rosa's nightstand, a picture of a young boy with dark hair and defiant, angry eyes. A boy Rosa prayed for every night, rosary beads clicking softly in the dark. "My Gabriel," Rosa used to whisper, "he is building a castle out of knives. One day he will cut himself to pieces." Nora looked at the man in the booth. The boy in the picture was gone, buried under custom-tailored Italian wool and a reputation carved in blood. But the eyes were the same. "She talked about you," Nora said. It was a risk, a massive, stupid risk, but the air in the room demanded the truth. "She said you were a smart boy, too smart for the neighborhood. She said you stopped coming around when you started making money, because you knew she wouldn't touch a dime of it." A muscle twitched in Gabriel's jaw. Behind him, Leo shifted his weight, his hand dropping casually to the lapel of his jacket. The other men tensed. "You did not speak to Gabriel Hayes about his personal failures. You did not insult his pride. Men had been thrown into the harbor with cinder blocks chained to their ankles for much less, but Gabriel just lowered his head. He looked at the cheap metal spoon resting in the empty bowl. When he spoke, his voice was a ragged whisper. "I tried to buy her a house in the hills. I tried to put security on her door. She slammed it in my face, told me the money smelled like copper." He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of the lingering spices into his lungs. "You make the staccato exactly like her. The cinnamon." "It's for the soul," Nora said softly. Gabriel's eyes snapped up, locking onto hers. The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, calculating intellect that had built his empire. He wasn't the starving animal anymore. He was the king again. He reached into his jacket. Then he let out a choked whimper from the corner, expecting a gun. Instead, Gabriel pulled out a thick money clip wrapped in silver. He peeled off 10 crisp $100 bills and dropped them onto the scratched formica table. "That's for the meal," Gabriel said, his voice flat, commanding. He stood up. The dizziness that had plagued him earlier was gone. The food was acting like a drug in his system, grounding him, fueling him. "And you're coming with me." Nora took a step back. "Excuse me?" "You work for me now," Gabriel stated, stepping out of the booth. He adjusted his jacket, his presence suddenly filling the small diner, suffocating and immense. "I pay you $10,000 a week. You cook my meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. You live in my building. You don't leave without my men." Nora's mind spun. 10,000 a week. It was more money than she made in a year. It meant nursing school paid in full. It meant out of the Narrows. But it also meant stepping into a cage with a predator. "I have a job," Nora said, gesturing loosely to the diner. "I have school." "Quit," Gabriel said smoothly, "and go to school online. I'll buy the laptops. I'll buy the professors. I don't care." "I don't cook for the mob," Nora shot back, the adrenaline finally overriding her common sense. "I'm not getting caught up in whatever gang war you're fighting. I made you a bowl of stew because you looked like you were going to drop dead on Benny's floor. That's it. We're done." The guards drew closer, their faces turning into stone masks. Leo took a half step forward. Gabriel held up a hand. The men froze. He looked at Nora, his gaze sliding over her cheap, faded uniform, the dark circles under her eyes, the frayed ends of her shoelaces. He saw the poverty. He recognized it. He had worn it once. "I haven't eaten a full meal in 8 days," Gabriel said, his tone devoid of anger. It was purely factual. "Cold. My underboss was poisoned. My syndicate is bleeding out because I am too weak to hold the reins. If I don't eat, I die. If I die, the city burns. Hundreds of people like you and Benny get caught in the crossfire when the streets go to war over my territory." He closed the distance between them. Nora held her breath as he stopped just inches away. He smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and the faint, coppery tang of danger. "I don't trust my chefs," Gabriel whispered, for her ears only. "I don't trust my capos. I don't trust the air I breathe right now, but I know my mother, and I know she wouldn't have taught her recipe to a liar. I trust the dirt and the spice, Nora. You're the only person in this city who can keep me alive." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the door. Leo opened it, the cold rain sweeping inside. "Pack a bag," Gabriel called out over his shoulder, stepping into the storm. "Leo will pick you up in 2 hours. Don't be late." The penthouse kitchen was larger than Nora's entire apartment. It was a sterile, gleaming monument to culinary perfection. White marble countertops stretched endlessly under the glare of recessed lighting. Dual industrial refrigerators hummed flawlessly in the corners. A professional 6-burner Wolf range sat waiting beneath a massive copper ventilation hood. It looked like a surgical theater. It felt completely dead. Nora stood in the center of it, holding a battered duffel bag against her chest. She wore her only decent pair of jeans and a grey, oversized sweater. She felt like a stray cat dropped into a museum. Leo stood by the entryway, his arms crossed. He had barely spoken during the drive from her cramped walk-up, but his eyes hadn't left her. It wasn't predatory. It was protective. "The pantry is fully stocked," Leo said, his deep, gravelly voice echoing off the marble. If you need anything specific, you write it on the list on the fridge. One of the boys will source it. But everything has to be factory sealed. You break the seal in front of me or one of the trusted guards. Understood?" "Understood," Nora said, dropping her bag onto a stool. "Where is he?" "Working," Leo replied. "He spent the whole night on the phones. First time he's had the energy to yell at the captains in a week. He wants breakfast in 30 minutes. Nora nodded. She walked over to the refrigerators and pulled open the heavy stainless steel doors. The contrast to Benny's diner was laughable. There were blocks of imported butter, cartons of organic farm eggs, thick cuts of dry-aged bacon, and sealed crates of produce that looked like they belonged in a magazine. She washed her hands at the massive farmhouse sink, tying her hair back into a tight bun. She ignored the expensive gadgets. She didn't touch the sous vide machine or the espresso maker. She pulled out a simple cast-iron skillet from the bottom cabinet, the only thing in the room that looked like it had actually been used. She cracked the eggs into a glass bowl, She didn't whisk them into a delicate, fluffy French omelette. She beat them hard, dropping them into the hot skillet with a generous knob of butter. She fried thick slabs of bacon until they were brittle and dark. She toasted 2 slices of thick sourdough bread and rubbed them with a clove of raw garlic, another of Rosa's tricks. She worked in silence, the rhythm of the kitchen settling her nerves. For a few minutes, she could pretend she wasn't trapped in a fortress, guarded by men with concealed weapons. She could just be a cook. When she plated the food, she turned to find Gabriel standing in the doorway. He was dressed in a dark grey suit, crisp and immaculate, no tie. The exhaustion was still etched deeply into the lines of his face, the dark shadows under his eyes serving as a reminder of his near starvation. But the physical shaking was gone. He stood straight, projecting a quiet, lethal authority that filled the vast room. He walked to the marble island and sat on one of the high stools. Nora slid the plate across the counter. The smell of fried eggs, sharp garlic, and heavy bacon fat hung in the pristine air. Gabriel didn't hesitate this time. He didn't look at the food with suspicion. He picked up a fork, cut a piece of the egg, and ate it. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling a slow breath through his nose. He ate methodically, deliberately, clearing the plate in less than 5 minutes. Nora poured a cup of black coffee from the drip machine she had forced into service and set it beside him. "You didn't run," Gabriel noted, taking a sip of the coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the mug. "Leo's men were parked outside my fire escape," Nora replied dryly, leaning against the counter. "I didn't think I'd get very far. Besides, you owe me 10 grand. The corner of Gabriel's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not exactly, but it was a break in the armor. "I do. Leo will handle your cash. You need a bank account secured. He'll set up a shell. IRS won't blink." "I don't need a shell company," Nora said, crossing her arms. "I just need to survive until the nursing board exams in 6 months. Then I'm done. I leave." Gabriel set the mug down. The faint amusement vanished. "You leave when I say you leave, Nora. Let's not confuse the arrangement. I'm a cook, not a prisoner. In my world, there is no difference. Not right now." Gabriel leaned forward, planting his forearms on the marble. The physical proximity made the air feel thin. "The man who poisoned Paulie is still breathing. That means there is a leak in my house. Someone with access. Someone who thought they could break the king by starving him out. Until I find that leak, sever it, and burn it to the ground, you are my lifeline, and I protect my lifelines." He stood up, towering over her. Despite the lingering fatigue in his frame, the sheer force of his presence was paralyzing. "Rosa used to make those garlic toasts," he said quietly, his voice shifting abruptly from a threat to a ghost of a memory. "When we couldn't afford meat. She said the garlic kept the sickness away." "She said it kept the devil away," Nora corrected him softly. Gabriel's eyes darkened, locking onto hers. "Same thing," he murmured. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his polished shoes silent against the hardwood floors of the hallway. Nora stood alone in the bright, cold room, staring at the empty plate. She had fed the wolf, but she knew the truth. The hunger in Gabriel Hayes wasn't just in his stomach. It was in his soul, and cooking for a man like that meant slowly giving him pieces of her own. At 2:00 a.m., the penthouse felt less like a cage and more like a crypt. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but all Nora saw was a grid of cold, distant lights. The world down there was asleep. Up here, time didn't exist. Nora sat at the marble kitchen island, a thick anatomy and physiology textbook open in front of her. She had a yellow highlighter clenched in her teeth. On the stove, a heavy Dutch oven held a slow-simmering chicken and dumpling soup. She had made the stock from scratch at noon, boiling down the bones until the liquid was liquid gold, rich with collagen and heavy with cracked black pepper. She heard the elevator ding at the end of the hall. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Heavy, uneven footsteps padded against the hardwood. Gabriel walked into the kitchen. He didn't look like the immaculate boss from 3 days ago. His suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His knuckles were split and weeping sluggishly. A dark, ugly bruise bloomed along his left cheekbone, turning the skin a mottled purple. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the textbook. He looked at the stove. "You're awake," he said. His voice was gravelly, scraped raw from a long night of shouting, or worse. "I study better when it's quiet," Nora replied. She didn't ask about his face. She didn't ask about the blood on his knuckles. In the Narrows, you learned early not to ask men why they were bleeding. You just handed them a towel. She slid off the stool, walked to the sink, and ran a clean dishcloth under cold water. She wrung it out and handed it to him. Gabriel took it. Their fingers brushed. His skin was freezing. "Thank you." He pressed the cold cloth to his knuckles with a quiet hiss, leaning heavily against the counter. He looked down at her textbook. "What chapter?" "Osteology. Bone repair," Nora said. She picked up a ceramic bowl and moved to the stove. She ladled the thick soup into the bowl. The steam rose, carrying the scent of rosemary, slow-cooked chicken fat, and dense, doughy dumplings. A fracture heals through a hematoma. The body floods the break with blood to create a clot. Then it builds a soft callus out of cartilage. It takes weeks, but eventually the bone knits back together. "It's actually stronger at the break line than it was before." She set the bowl on the island, right next to his hand. Gabriel stared at the textbook's diagram of a shattered femur. He tossed the bloody dishcloth into the sink. "In my experience, when you break something, it stays broken. It never moves the same way again." "That's because you break things on purpose," Nora said, sliding a spoon toward him. "You don't let them set right." Gabriel let out a short, hollow laugh. It was a dark sound. He picked up the spoon and sat down. For the first few days, he had eaten with a frantic, desperate energy, a man pulling himself back from the ledge of starvation. Tonight, his movements were slow, methodical. The food had restored his strength, but the paranoia was a permanent resident in his eyes. "Is it good?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "It tastes like a Sunday in 1998, Gabriel murmured, taking another bite. The dumplings were dense, soaking up the rich broth perfectly. "Rosa made this when I had pneumonia. I was 14. We couldn't afford the clinic. She boiled a whole chicken and fed me the broth for 3 days straight. She sat in a hard wooden chair by my bed the entire time. She was a tough woman," Nora said quietly. "She was stubborn," Gabriel corrected, his gaze drifting to the dark windows. "She thought she could protect me from the neighborhood by locking the door. She didn't understand that the neighborhood was already inside the walls. The mold, the cold, the landlords who shut off the heat in January. I didn't become this because I wanted a crown, Nora. I did it because I was tired of freezing. I was tired of watching her hands crack from washing dishes in cold water." He took another slow bite. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "Did you find the leak?" Nora asked. It was a dangerous question. Gabriel stopped chewing. He swallowed, resting his forearms on the marble. His dark eyes flicked to her, measuring, calculating. "No. But I narrowed the list. There are only 3 men who had the access and the motive to spike Paulie's plate. They're coming here tomorrow night for dinner." Nora's stomach dropped. Here, in the penthouse? Yes. And you want me to cook? I want you to cook, Gabriel confirmed. And I want you to serve it, personally. No one else touches the plates. No one else walks into this kitchen. If one of them is the rat, he's going to come expecting to see a dying man. I want him to see me eat. I want him to watch me chew. I want him to know he failed. Gabriel, I'm a waitress, not a prop in a mob execution. You're a survivor, Nora, Gabriel said softly, leaning forward. The bruised, battered angles of his face caught the harsh kitchen light. You see things. At the diner, you knew exactly what Benny needed to hear to snap out of his panic. You know exactly what spices calm me down. Tomorrow night, I want you in that dining room. I want you to watch them. Watch them for what? Guilt, Gabriel whispered. A rat always flinches before the trap snaps. The dining room was an exercise in intimidation. A massive slab of polished black walnut served as the table, surrounded by 12 high-backed leather chairs. A low-hanging crystal chandelier cast a sharp, brilliant light over the centers of the room, leaving the corners drowning in shadow. Nora stood just inside the kitchen's swinging door, holding a silver serving tray. Her hands were sweating. She had traded her oversized sweater for a crisp black button-down and dark slacks Leo had provided. She looked like high-end waitstaff. She felt like a hostage. 3 men sat at the table with Gabriel. To Gabriel's right was Dominic, a massive, bearded man with a voice like a grinding engine. He was eating the roasted lamb chops Nora had prepared with a loud, aggressive hunger. To Gabriel's left was Carmine, an older man with silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit. He ate carefully, cutting his meat into precise squares, his eyes darting constantly to Gabriel. At the far end of the table sat Arthur. He was younger, perhaps early 30s, with slicked-back hair and a nervous energy that he tried to hide behind a smirk. Gabriel sat at the head of the table. He was a different creature entirely tonight. The bruised, exhausted man from the kitchen was gone. He wore a midnight blue suit that swallowed the light. His posture was relaxed, leaning back in his chair with a glass of red wine resting in his palm. He looked vibrant, lethal. The color was fully back in his face, his eyes sharp and unblinking. The ports are secure, Dominic grumbled around a mouthful of lamb. The Colombians tried to push the northern dock Tuesday. We pushed back. 3 of their trucks went into the river. Good, Gabriel said smoothly. He sliced a piece of meat. He ate it deliberately. Every time he chewed, the tension in the room ratcheted up a notch. The men were staring at him. They were looking for the tremor in his hands. They were looking for the hollows in his cheeks. They found nothing but reinforced steel. Nora stepped into the room to clear the empty salad plates. She moved silently, her eyes downcast. She approached Dominic first. He ignored her. She moved to Carmine. He offered a polite, clipped nod. Then she approached Arthur. Arthur's plate was half full. But it wasn't his food Nora noticed. It was his hands. They rested on the edge of the walnut table. His cuticles were chewed raw and bleeding. The ice in his water glass rattled faintly as his knee bounced under the table. When Nora reached for his plate, he flinched, hard. Nora paused. She looked at his face. Arthur was sweating. A thin sheen of moisture coated his upper lip. He was staring at Gabriel's plate, a look of pure, unadulterated terror masking his features. He wasn't looking at the lamb. He was looking at the man eating it, unable to comprehend how Gabriel was still breathing. Nora picked up the plate. She turned to walk back to the kitchen. As she passed Gabriel, she let her hip bump the edge of the heavy table. It was a subtle jar, just enough to shift Gabriel's wine glass a fraction of an inch. Gabriel's eyes snapped to her. Nora didn't look at him, but she subtly tilted her head toward the far end of the table, toward Arthur. Gabriel caught the cue. His expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room plummeted. "Arthur," Gabriel said. The room went dead silent. Dominic stopped chewing. Carmine froze with his fork in the air. Arthur jerked upright. "Yeah, boss?" "You aren't eating," Gabriel noted, his voice smooth, like velvet over broken glass. "I'm full. The lamb is rich. Stomach's a little off today." Arthur tried to smile. It looked like a grimace. "Is it?" Gabriel stood up slowly. He picked up his own plate, which still held a thick, perfectly cooked chop, resting in a pool of dark rosemary au jus. He walked down the length of the table. His footsteps were completely silent on the thick Persian rug. He stopped next to Arthur. He set the plate down in front of him. "Eat mine," Gabriel said. Arthur stared at the plate. The color drained from his face, leaving him the color of old ash. "Gabriel, I told you, I'm stuffed. I can't take another bite." "It's a shame to waste it," Gabriel murmured, leaning down. He placed a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. His fingers dug into the fabric of the suit, gripping the muscle beneath like a vice. "You've been very concerned about my diet lately, Arthur. I hear you asking Leo about it every day. I hear you asking the guards if I'm keeping food down. You care about my health. So I want you to share a meal with me." Arthur's chest began to heave. He looked at Dominic. He looked at Carmine. Neither man moved. They were veterans. They recognized the smell of blood in the water. "Boss, please," Arthur whispered. "Eat the meat, Arthur." Arthur reached for the fork. His hand shook so violently, he dropped it against the porcelain with a loud clatter. He couldn't do it. He shoved the chair back, trying to stand, trying to run. Gabriel's left hand shot out. He grabbed Arthur by the back of the neck and slammed his face down into the walnut table. The crack of bone against wood echoed like a gunshot. Arthur screamed, a wet, muffled sound. Leo materialized from the shadows, stepping into the dining room with his weapon drawn. Gabriel didn't pull a gun. He just pressed Arthur's face harder into the table, leaning in close to the man's ear. "You paid the prep cook 300 grand to lace Paulie's risotto. You thought you could starve me out. You thought paranoia would do what a bullet couldn't." "He made me do it," Arthur sobbed against the wood, blood pooling around his nose. "The Chicago families. They said if you didn't step down, they'd kill my kids, Gabriel. They made me." Gabriel's eyes were dead. "They should have killed you." Gabriel looked up. He met Nora's eyes. She was still standing by the kitchen door, clutching the silver tray to her chest, her knuckles white. She was terrified. She was looking at the monster the city feared. Gabriel nodded to Leo. "Get him out of my house. Take him to the docks. Send Chicago a message." Leo hauled the sobbing man up by his collar and dragged him toward the freight elevator. Dominic and Carmine sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead. Gabriel pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped a single drop of Arthur's blood off the polished table. He looked at the two remaining captains. "Dinner is over," Gabriel said quietly. "Get out." The heavy oak doors of the dining room clicked shut, sealing off the silence. Nora stood in the kitchen, her back pressed against the cold stainless steel of the industrial refrigerator. She was shaking. The tremors started in her knees and worked their way up to her shoulders, violent and uncontrollable. She had grown up in the Narrows. She had seen men bleed on the sidewalk outside her apartment building. She had patched up stab wounds with duct tape and gauze while waiting for ambulances that took an hour to arrive. But she had never seen a man's life extinguished with a simple, quiet nod. Gabriel hadn't yelled. He hadn't postured. He had simply handed down a death sentence like he was checking off a grocery list. Nora walked to the farmhouse sink. She turned the hot water on full blast. She plunged her hands into the scalding stream, grabbing a bristled brush and scrubbing at her palms. She hadn't touched Arthur. She hadn't touched the blood on the table, but her skin felt coated in it. She scrubbed until her knuckles were bright red and stinging. "You're burning yourself." The voice was low, tired. Gabriel stood in the doorway, connecting the kitchen to the dining room. He had taken off the midnight blue suit jacket. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. The terrifying apex predator who had just broken a man's face against a walnut table was gone. He just looked like a man carrying a massive, invisible weight. Nora didn't turn off the water. She kept scrubbing. He was begging. Gabriel walked into the kitchen. His footsteps were slow. He stopped beside the island, leaning his weight against the marble. He sold out his own crew. He took Chicago's money, put poison on a plate, and watched Paulie choke on his own blood. If I let him walk out of here, I lose the respect of every captain in this city. Tomorrow, it wouldn't just be my food poisoned. It would be car bombs, drive-bys, civilians caught in the crossfire. Nora finally dropped the brush. She shut off the faucet. The sudden quiet in the kitchen was deafening. She gripped the edge of the sink, refusing to turn around. "You used me. You put me in that room to play detective because you knew I'd see the panic in him. I put you in that room because you understand survival," Gabriel corrected her, his voice devoid of malice. "You saw what my men couldn't see. You saw the human element. Dominic and Carmine only look at the numbers. They look at the guns. You looked at the man." "I heal people, Gabriel," Nora whispered, her voice cracking. She turned around to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her jaw clenched tight. "I study anatomy to fix broken bones. I learn pharmacology to cure infections. I don't point fingers so you can send people to the bottom of the river. I made you a bowl of stew to keep you from starving. I didn't sign up to be your accomplice." Gabriel held her gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a hollow apology. He absorbed her anger, letting it hit him squarely. "You didn't point a finger," Gabriel said softly. "You bumped a table. I made the call. The blood is on my hands, Nora. It always has been. It always will be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver money clip. He peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills and laid them on the counter. "I asked you to serve dinner. That's a tip." Nora stared at the money. It felt dirty. It felt like a payoff for her silence, a down payment on her soul. She stepped forward, snatched the bills off the counter, and shoved them back into Gabriel's chest. "Keep your money," she snapped. "I don't want a tip for watching a man get dragged to his grave." Gabriel caught her wrist before she could pull away. His grip wasn't punishing, but it was absolute. His hand was warm, the skin rough with calluses. Nora froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, bird-like flutter. They were inches apart. She could smell the red wine on his breath, mixed with the faint scent of rain and gunpowder. "Do you know why I didn't die in that diner?" Gabriel asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping away the layers of her defiance, seeing right down to the terrified girl beneath. "It wasn't just the recipe. It was you. You looked at me, and you weren't afraid of the crown. You were just angry that I was wasting good meat." He let go of her wrist. His fingers grazed her knuckles, a brief, electrifying touch, before he stepped back. "I live in a world where everyone either wants to kill me or worships me," Gabriel said, the exhaustion finally creeping back into his posture. "Both are dangerous. You're the first person in 10 years who just looked at me as a man who needed to eat. I won't apologize for doing what I have to do to keep this city from tearing itself apart. But I will promise you this. He paused, holding her eyes with a fierce, uncompromising intensity. You will never have to serve a meal like that again. From now on, the violence stays outside these walls. In this kitchen, you are untouchable. Gabriel turned and walked out of the room, leaving the $500 sitting on the marble counter. Nora stood alone in the bright, sterile light. She looked at her hands. The shaking had finally stopped. She wasn't entirely sure if that was a good thing. It meant she was adapting. It meant the Narrows were still in her blood, and the darkness of Gabriel's world was starting to feel dangerously familiar. 4 weeks passed. The penthouse fell into a strange domestic rhythm that defied the bloodshed of the world below. Gabriel's empire stabilized. With Arthur gone, the remaining captains fell aggressively into line. The northern docks were locked down. The supply routes flowed. Gabriel spent his days in the sprawling living room, barking orders into burner phones, reviewing ledgers, and rebuilding the fortress of his syndicate. He was ruthless, efficient, and untouchable. But at night, he belonged to the kitchen. Nora had taken over the space completely. She stopped asking permission to break the seals on the groceries. She fired Benny a text, arranged for Benny's diner to get a mysterious, anonymous grant for a full kitchen renovation, and completely ignored Leo's nervous hovering. She cooked whatever she wanted. She roasted whole chickens with lemon and thyme. She baked thick, crusty loaves of bread that filled the penthouse with the scent of yeast and warmth. She made heavy, spicy arrabbiata pasta that Gabriel ate in complete silence, savoring every bite. It was a Tuesday evening. The rain was lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the neon skyline into a smear of colors. Nora sat at the island, a thick pharmacology textbook open, a notebook full of chemical structures beside it. Her nursing exam was exactly 22 days away. Gabriel walked in. He wore dark slacks and a black fitted sweater that highlighted the broad, heavy set of his shoulders. He carried a long, rectangular box wrapped in plain brown paper. He didn't say a word. He walked to the island and set the box down on top of her notebook. Nora looked up, blinking away the fatigue of memorizing drug interactions. What is this? Did Leo find the imported olive oil I asked for? Open it, Gabriel said. He pulled out a stool and sat across from her. He looked relaxed. The grey pallor of starvation was a distant memory. His jawline was sharp, his skin flushed with health. He looked at her with a quiet, steady heat that always made the back of her neck prickle. Nora untied the twine. She pulled back the paper. Inside was a polished wooden case. She unlatched the brass hinges and opened the lid. It was a knife, a custom Japanese nakiri. The blade was forged from high-carbon steel, the metal folded over itself in a beautiful, wavy Damascus pattern. The handle was crafted from dark, rich walnut, perfectly balanced. It was a vicious, elegant tool. It looked more like a weapon than a piece of cutlery. Nora carefully lifted it from the velvet lining. The weight of it in her hand was perfect. It felt like an extension of her arm. I noticed you were using the old cast-iron skillet to smash garlic, Gabriel said, leaning his forearms on the marble. The steel on the house knives is cheap. It dulls too fast. A good cook needs good steel. Nora traced the flat of the blade with her thumb. It was easily a $2,000 knife. In the Narrows, men killed each other for a fraction of that cost. Gabriel, this is too much. I can't accept this. It's a tool, Nora, not a diamond necklace, he said smoothly. You keep me alive. The least I can do is make sure you aren't struggling to chop a carrot. She looked at him. The air between them shifted, growing heavy and thick. For the past month, they had danced around the unspoken reality of their arrangement. She was a captive who was paid $10,000 a week. He was a captor who trusted her more than his own blood. They lived in forced proximity, sharing quiet meals in the dead of night, sharing the ghosts of their pasts. It was an impossible, highly flammable dynamic. "My exam is in 3 weeks," Nora said softly, putting the knife back in the box. She didn't look away from him. She needed to push the boundary. She needed to know where the cage ended. "What happens when I pass, Gabriel? Do I get to pack my bags? Do I get to walk out the front door and work the night shift at Mercy Hospital?" Gabriel's expression didn't change, but his eyes went dark. The relaxed demeanor vanished, replaced by the calculating predator. He stared at her, tracing the line of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes, the stubborn set of her mouth. "You think you're safe at Mercy Hospital?" he asked, his voice dropping in volume. "You think you can just step back into the world and pretend you don't know what the inside of this penthouse looks like?" "I don't care about your ledgers or your capos," Nora argued, her pulse picking up speed. "I just want my life back." Gabriel stood up. He walked around the island, stepping into her personal space. Nora didn't back away. She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. "You don't have a life back there anymore," Gabriel said quietly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, before he gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly tender, a massive contrast to the violence she knew his hands were capable of. "You belong to this house now. You belong to—" The kitchen door slammed open. Gabriel's hand dropped instantly. He spun around, his posture shifting into a defensive, lethal stance. Leo stood in the doorway. He was breathing hard, a rarity for the massive enforcer. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his hand resting directly on the grip of the pistol holstered at his hip. "Boss," Leo said, his voice tight. "What is it?" Gabriel demanded, the softness completely stripped from his tone. "It's Chicago," Leo grimaced. "They didn't back down after Arthur. They escalated. They just hit 2 of our supply trucks on the south side, burned them to the axles." Leo paused, his eyes flicking to Nora before snapping back to Gabriel. "And we pulled a guy out of the wreckage before the cops arrived. He was talking. They aren't looking for the capos anymore, Gabriel. They're looking for the girl." Nora's blood ran cold. "They know she's the one keeping you fed," Leo finished grimly. "They put a $500,000 bounty on her head." The air in the penthouse shattered. The fragile domestic quiet they had built over the last month evaporated in the space of a single breath. $500,000. In the underworld, that wasn't just a bounty. It was a hunting license. It meant every low-level thug, every corrupt cop, and every rival hitman in a 3-state radius was going to start looking for the girl who cooked for Gabriel Hayes. Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't swear. He simply turned away from Nora, his face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. The warmth in his eyes died, replaced by the freezing calculation of a wartime general. "Leo," Gabriel said. His voice was a flat, dead monotone. "Lock down the elevators. Kill the security cameras in the lobby and run the feed directly to a closed-loop server. Call Dominic and Carmine. Tell them to arm every soldier on the payroll. We are at war." Leo nodded once, pulling his phone from his pocket as he backed out of the kitchen. Gabriel turned back to Nora. He didn't step into her space this time. He kept a deliberate distance, as if his proximity was suddenly radioactive. "Pack a bag, 10 minutes. Only the essentials." Nora's hands gripped the edge of the marble island. Her heart slammed violently against her breastbone, but the panic she expected didn't come. Instead, a cold, rigid clarity washed over her. It was the same clarity she used to stitch up knife wounds in the Narrows. You didn't panic when the blood flowed. You found the source. You stopped it. "Where am I going?" Nora asked. Her voice didn't shake. "Upstate," Gabriel replied, walking toward the heavy oak doors. "I have a property in the Adirondacks. 10 acres. Fortified. I'm sending 6 of my best men with you. You'll stay there until I wipe the Chicago syndicate off the map. It might take a month. It might take 6. You don't leave the perimeter." "And what are you going to eat, Gabriel?" Gabriel stopped in the doorway. He didn't turn around. His broad shoulders tensed under the black fabric of his sweater. "I'll survive," he said quietly. "You'll starve," Nora corrected him, her voice echoing off the sterile tile and stainless steel. "You told me yourself. The paranoia will come back. You'll look at a plate of food and you'll see poison. You'll start shaking again. You'll lose your grip on the captains. If you try to fight a war on an empty stomach, they will kill you." Gabriel turned slowly. The brutal, unforgiving light of the kitchen caught the sharp angles of his face. "If you stay here, Nora, you are a target. They will not stop. They will bomb the lobby. They will snipe the windows. I would rather die of starvation than watch you bleed out on my floor." The confession hung in the air. It was bare. It was completely stripped of his usual armor. Nora stared at him. She looked around the kitchen. She looked at her open pharmacology textbook. She looked at the simmering pot of sauce on the stove. And finally, she looked at the custom Nakiri knife resting in its velvet-lined box. She had spent her whole life running from the darkness of the city. She had put her head down, worked double shifts, and studied until her eyes burned, all to buy a ticket out of the violence. But looking at Gabriel, she realized something fundamental. Safety was an illusion. You couldn't outrun the monsters. You could only choose which monster stood beside you in the dark. Nora reached into the wooden box. She wrapped her hand around the dark walnut handle of the knife. The high-carbon steel gleamed, heavy and perfectly balanced. She walked around the marble island, closing the distance between them. Gabriel watched her, his chest rising and falling with a slow, measured rhythm. His eyes tracked the blade in her hand, then flicked up to her face. "I am not going to a cabin in the woods," Nora said flatly. "Nora, this isn't a negotiation." "Yes, it is." She stopped 2 feet in front of him. She didn't flinch under his heavy, suffocating gaze. "If I run, I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I become a ghost. I'm not doing that. I belong to this house now." "You said it yourself." Gabriel's jaw clenched. "You don't understand what is about to happen in this city. The streets are going to run red. Then you are going to need your strength," Nora replied. She stepped closer, sliding the knife smoothly into the leather sheath resting on the counter beside her. She reached up, resting her palm flat against Gabriel's chest, feeling the heavy, steady thud of his heart beneath the sweater. "You keep the bullets out of my kitchen. I keep the food on your plate. We survive this together." Gabriel looked down at her. The violent storm in his eyes shifted, settling into something far deeper and far more dangerous than simple anger. It was possession. It was absolute devotion. He raised his hand, covering hers where it pressed against his chest, his fingers intertwined with hers. "They will come for you," Gabriel whispered, leaning his forehead down to rest against hers. "Let them come," Nora said softly. "They'll have to get through you first." Gabriel let out a ragged breath. A dark, terrifying smile curved the edges of his mouth. The king was no longer starving. He was fed. He was armed. And now he had something to protect. "Leo!" Gabriel barked, not moving an inch away from Nora. Leo appeared in the doorway, an assault rifle now slung across his chest. "Boss, Cancel the convoy, Gabriel ordered, his voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. Double the guard on the penthouse doors. Bring the captains here. If Chicago wants a war, they can come to my front door. We aren't running. Nora pulled back slightly, looking into Gabriel's eyes. The fear was gone. In its place was the fire of the Narrows. Tempered by the steel of Gabriel's world, she turned away from the door, walking back to the stove to check the heat on the sauce. The city outside the glass was about to burn. But inside the kitchen, the chef was exactly where she belonged, and the boss finally had a reason to live. That wraps up the intense, blood-soaked journey of Gabriel and Nora. From a starving king and a quiet waitress to a mafia boss and the woman who became his anchor. If you loved this gritty, deeply human dive into loyalty, survival, and the power of a single memory, drop a comment below and tell us your favorite moment. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance and crime drama fans, and subscribe to the channel for more original, high-stakes storytelling.